Greetings, dear listeners. Our topic today is idolatry. In our contemporary discussions on religion, the concept of idolatry does not play a central role. The general assumption is that everyone should be allowed to live according to their own faith, and as such, we should not categorize people's religions in terms of true and false. But according to Professor William Cavanaugh, idolatry is a very useful concept to analyze our contemporary society and to question the often taken for granted borders of the religious versus the secular. So that's why he recently published his book, The Uses of Idolatry. Professor Cavanaugh, great to have you back on the show.
Oh, it's fun to be back. Thanks, Jonas.
Bill, before we delve in, could you perhaps first present yourself a bit to the listeners, because probably not all of them listened to our previous conversations about the myth of religious violence, so some of them might be wondering who you are.
I'm a pretty boring person. I'm a professor of theology. I'm actually in a Catholic Studies department at DePaul University in Chicago.
Okay, great. I wouldn't call you boring.
I don't know what else you want me to say.
No, that's perfectly fine. But I wouldn't call you a boring professor. I love all the books I read that you wrote, and that's the same with this one, The Uses of Idolatry. I must say, I find it a brilliant book again, very worthwhile to read. So I'd recommend any listener to go and buy it and pick it up and read the full thing. But in your introduction, you also mentioned that you intended this book somewhat as a sequel or something to pick up where the myth of religious violence left off. But I got the feeling going through it that it's more of a bit of bringing all of your work together, because it's also about consumer society, also about liturgical theology, let's call it that way. And so I'd say there's quite some vintage Cavanaugh in the book, but it kind of brings it all together. It rolls everything into one overarching argument, which on the one hand I really liked, but on the other hand, as a podcast maker, that really troubled me, because it's so difficult to figure out how to start this conversation. So that's why I thought today, perhaps I shouldn't intellectually start from one of the topics in the book, but I'd rather emotionally start from a personal frustration. And that personal frustration is the following. Your book is one of the new books that really tries to breach the borders between religion and secularism. And there's my problem immediately, that lots of books and lots of people, let's say from G.C. Smith, Talal Assad, Masuzawa, Fitzgerald, and we could go on and on and on, people that you also mention or refer to in the book. By now, their arguments have been so fully worked out, they're so strong, most people in the field know it. The dichotomy or the binary of religious versus secularism, academically speaking, we kind of know it should be thrown out of the window, but you have to restart again and again and again. And so if you write a book like The Uses of Idolatry, you first kind of have to explain why it's a useful concept to start analyzing our contemporary society. Because in the back of your mind, you constantly have something like, somebody will stand up and say, why are you analyzing society from the standpoint of idolatry? We're a secular society now. And so there's my frustration that on the one hand, the academic field of religious studies has amply shown how problematic the binary of religious versus secular is. On the other hand, there hasn't been much of a trickle-down effect, not even in most other parts of academia. And so you have to restart from the beginning and again and again and again. How's that frustration for you? You feel the same thing, or?
Yeah, sure. I feel the same frustration. I mean, I don't think it's necessarily that different from other fields. I mean, I can imagine climate scientists have been saying, hey, we've been talking about, global warming since the 1970s and nobody's paying attention. And now, even when it's becoming abundantly obvious that this is a problem, people still don't want to, So the religious secular dichotomy is still there because it's useful. right? And not necessarily in a good way. And so the academic arguments, I think, have made a dent in the way we think about those sorts of matters. But in order for it to be a kind of the sea change that we're looking for, it's going to take a lot more than just academic books to make that happen. And one of the things I'm trying to do in this book is, on the one hand, present a more sympathetic account of that too, like understanding the uses of these kinds of dichotomies, and also understanding the kind of motivations that drive people in a sympathetic way instead of just a kind of critique. And I'm also trying to kind of present a sort of theological take on this. So it's one thing to say that there isn't any difference between the essential difference between the religious and the secular, but it's another thing to kind of work that out in a sort of positive and theological direction. And so that's what I hope is something that's a little bit new that I'm bringing to this conversation.
Yeah, definitely that theological part to it, and then I want to get to that, but a bit later in the conversation. So let me first pick up on what you said. It's still useful, but I think it's not just useful. It's inherent in the concept itself that it becomes almost impossible to see it for what it is. And I mean, you've got a subtitle in one of the chapters, which is The Myth of Having No Myth. And that's what I mean. It's a mythology that presents itself as the only mythology that is not a mythology. It's like we're speaking a language, but we're using the only language that isn't a real language.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right. So, you can talk all you want about the death of modernity or whatever, but we're still kind of suffocating under the corpse. And so, and it's not because people are stupid. It's because these kinds of concepts really do serve a function. And I think it's a negative function, but it's a function, and that's
yeah, like your book explains, it's the function of we're on top of the evolution of mankind, the ones that have left all those myths behind, and that in itself, that's why you say is the myth having no myth. And so then you bring in the concept of idolatry, as if secularism and religion wasn't bad enough or difficult enough to talk about. You bring in idolatry, which is a concept that people think that we have really left behind, like I said in the introduction, because that reeks of thinking that the other people have a wrong idea about God and you have the right idea. But you bring it in. So time to perhaps explain your basic point of why it makes sense when we talk about the binary of religion secularism, why it does make sense to bring in idolatry as well.
Yeah, I have a tendency to try to resuscitate unpopular theological concepts. In my first book, it was excommunication, in the context of excommunicating torturers in Chile, which I thought was a pretty good idea, but was not kind of it's not a very popular concept, and for good reasons, right? So idolatry is also unpopular for good reasons. I mean, it's used in the Bible to support violence against others. Look at Deuteronomy 7, and it's a concept that's used to legitimate violence against the Canaanites. It's used in colonial contexts to do the same. The Aztecs were idolaters, and therefore we have the right to enslave them. Used by the British in India. The Hindus are heathens and idolaters, and so on. So there's good reasons to avoid the term, but I think there's also good reasons why first of all, it's just theologically speaking, the term is unavoidable. You have to be able to separate true worship from false worship. And there are consequences for false worship that are dire. And I think we just need to recognize that. And so even a figure like Pope Francis, who's renowned for being accepting of others and welcoming and trying to kind of get away from a church that just condemns. He uses the term idolatry all the time, specifically when he's talking about economic matters. The capitalist system that we live under is the worship of a false god. And so that kind of language, I think, is necessary when we're looking at something that's productive of enormous amounts of human suffering and has taken on the status of something that's unquestionable. And so I think it's really useful for kind of condemnation. But what I'm trying to bring out in the book is a much more sympathetic reading of idolatry, and to show the way that the concept can blur lines rather than accentuate them. And so one thing it does is it blurs the line between religion on the one hand and politics and economics on the other hand. And so we think that you can't condemn somebody else's religious views, but you can condemn their political and economic views. And what I'm trying to show is that these are not separate things, but that it needs to be kind of taken as a whole. When the Bible condemns Baalism, it's not just religious bigotry, but it's also a certain oppressive economic and political system. The concept of idolatry also blurs the line between good people and bad people in some ways, because it recognizes that, or can recognize, have the ability to recognize anyway, that we are all worshipers of one kind or another, and our worship has a tendency to fall on all kinds of different objects. And so, and that's true of us as well. The Bible's use of the concept of idolatry is more self-critique of the Israelites than it is critique of others, although there is critique of others there as well. But it can kind of blur these lines between believers and non-believers, between worshipers and non-worshipers, and show that we all worship something, and we all worship badly. And so we need kind of, protocols to help us worship less badly. And so it's a way of kind of leveling the playing field and breaking down the dichotomy between, believers that supposedly have just, irrational beliefs and non-believers that have only facts. And there's also this moment of sympathy that you find in the biblical text, that the reason, like it says in Wisdom 13, the reason that people become idolaters is that God has made the world beautiful, and so we fall in love with it. And that's a kind of sympathetic take on idolatry that I think we can make a lot out of. I mean, we're material creatures, right? We're, like Madonna says, we're living in a material world, and I am a material girl, right? I mean, that's true of all of us, and so it's hard to worship an invisible God. And so there's all these moments of sympathy and ways in which the concept of idolatry sort of breaks down these dichotomies that I think are really potentially useful. And so that's why I've tried to rehabilitate this very unpopular concept.
One of the logical or spontaneous reactions of somebody who's, let's say, a fan of secularizing the world, one of the logical reactions might now be, well, perhaps in the biblical sense, when people worship Baal, it came together with a whole economic structure, and when they were so anti the Egyptian religion or gods, that's because Pharaoh himself was God and he was suppressing the Jews and so on. So it's a whole package in the Bible, perhaps. But today, the whole point is that we should have separated those two, and if we didn't, that we should keep on trying to separate the two, and so that worship and religion and should be private, and then the politics and the economics should be something public. What would be your reaction to that?
I'm not sure it's possible. And I think that's part of what I'm trying to show with the rise of nationalism, chapter 6, and the rise of consumer culture in chapter 7, is that it seems like there's a vacuum that is created that is going to be filled, right? And so I look, in the case of nationalism, at the work of Ernest Gellner and Benedict Anderson and many other scholars who kind of show that the decline of Christendom in the West leads to the rise of nationalism. It becomes a new sort of religion. And the same sort of analysis is going on in chapter 7 with capitalism, and this is what I think Weber, in his own way, could see, that we're constantly creating gods that react back against us and oppress us. And this does not obey any distinction between religion on the one hand and politics and economics on the other hand. And so the answer to this is not no gods, but good gods, as it were. Marx and Nietzsche, of course, thought that once you got rid of the gods, then we would be liberated from this. Or Nietzsche at least thought we could start creating our own gods. But from a theological point of view, I just don't think self-created gods is the answer to this. I think what you need is a real God, a good God, and that's the argument that I try to make in the final chapter.
And just to emphasize this point, there's this quote in the book which I kind of like. We miss the similarities between what goes on in a cathedral and what goes on in a shopping mall when we try to separate them into religious and secular categories. And I think that's really true. I always have made the comparison. I don't know what the English term for those shopping sprees, holidays would be, but I guess in the US it's Black Friday or something, when thousands and even millions of people stampede to the temples of today, let's say the shopping malls. If we'd see that in India, we would think it's a Kumbh Mela, which is a pilgrimage to some sacred site. And so that's also what you do in the book, really make clear it's not necessarily about what people believe, but if you just look at what they do and where they bow their knees, so to speak, what they really think is worth it to fill their holidays with, then you kind of see what their true God is, or what the thing is that they bow to.
Right, exactly. And that's one of the reasons why I want to push back on Charles Taylor's idea of modern selves as buffered selves. If you look at the people lining up outside the Best Buy, ready to run in, for discounted electronics at midnight on Thanksgiving, these are not buffered selves. And the more we can see what's going on there, the more we have an accurate portrayal of our society.
Yeah. In a sense, you seem to be saying quite a similar thing as Durkheim has, and you talk a lot about Durkheim in the book as well, but just to clarify for some of the more scholarly listeners, if they have the sense of, but Durkheim was also already in the beginning of the 20th century talking about every society creates whatever it thinks the sacred might be, and then it creates a social structure around the sacred, but the sacred itself is not the point. It's the fact that you have something that you set apart, which you make sacred. And because it's set apart, you kind of reflect your own society in that thing which is set apart, and you think you're worshipping something, but what you're actually doing is just creating cohesion among the general society. And that for him is religion, as you fully explained. But so where would you see a distinction? Where do you go beyond Durkheim?
Well, the only thing Durkheim is lacking is God, right?
Quite something.
I mean, you remember Durkheim was, he studied at rabbinical school. He came from a long line of rabbis. I think his father and his grandfather and his great-grandfather were all rabbis. And Durkheim himself dropped out of rabbinical school at some point. And basically, what I want to do is send Durkheim back to rabbinical school to finish, where he would discover that the reason people have this tendency to create these forms of worship is because there's an actual uh, God out there, right? The reason there's a God-shaped hole in our hearts is because there's an actual God out there. So for Durkheim, there's no escape from this, right? We disguise self-worship, collective self-worship, as the worship of some god, and so we're constantly creating new gods, and there's really no escape from that. And he's fairly optimistic about that sort of thing, at least until World War One happens, right? I mean, his Elementary Forms of the Religious Life was published in 1912, and he talks about the kind of collective effervescence that we need to reanimate. You know, now that Christianity has died, what we need is this kind of collective effervescence, and he saw that in kind of French patriotism. And then his own son was killed in World War One, and that was a blow from which he never recovered, and he died just a couple years later. And that's the tragedy of it, I think, is that, you know, he saw that we create these gods, and he didn't think that we had any choice but to create our own gods. And he was optimistic that this might, in some sense, be our salvation. And I don't think that's true, right? And so I want to send him back to rabbinical school and give him a hope that there's an actual real God out there that could still save us.
Yeah, and again, to be a bit of the devil's advocate, some people might say, yeah, right, in the First World War and in the Second, the nation state had fully become God, or to use your terms, the migration of the holy from the church to the state had completely happened. And so people sacrificed not only the lives of others, but their own lives for this new universal God, the state, with all the atrocities that ensued. But they might say, all fair and well, but religion before, when they were truly following God, between scarce quotes, they did just as much damage and violence and so on. So why insist on Durkheim should have perhaps also been thinking about the real God, and that is the gap that, or the hole that people are trying to fill, namely the hole of a real God that they're missing. Why return to the God which also demanded all that sacrifice in history?
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's a fair question. I mean, in general, the body counts pre-modernity were much smaller than the body counts post-modernity. You know, people talk about the Crusades and the Inquisition and so on. That kind of pales in comparison. You know, over the course of the 350 years of the Spanish Inquisition, for example, scholars estimate that between 3,000 and 5,000 people were killed, which is about how many people the Pol Pot regime killed every 3 days in Cambodia, right? So 350 years versus 3 days. But I don't want to just rely on statistical, you know, body counts. I mean, I think there's no question that Christianity, Islam, other faiths can and do promote violence. There's no question about that. So the book, The Myth of Religious Violence, is not an attempt to deny that, right? It's an attempt to say there's no reason to suppose that supposedly secular regimes are any less inclined to promote violence. People do kill for gods. They also kill for flags and free markets and the workers' revolution and on and on. So the argument at some point has to go beyond empirical claims to normative claims. And so as a theologian, what I'm trying to do is present a normative claim that there actually is a God out there who can save us from ourselves and give us a way out of this kind of imminent trap, which is essentially violent. And so the figure of Jesus Christ is crucial to me, and that's what I tried to bring out in the final chapter on incarnation and sacrament. And it all depends on the possibility that there might be this nonviolent God who absorbs the violence of the world and doesn't give it back, and that, in some sense, provides the possibility of a way out of this. And so that's what I'm staking my claim on. It's a normative argument.
I'd like to delve deeper in that normative argument, but a bit more towards the end, where we can discuss some topics of the last chapter of the book. But first, let's stick where we were with idolatry as a good concept to blur the lines of secular versus religious. And perhaps we also have to bring in a bit of the enchantment, disenchantment part, because you discuss Weber, you discuss Taylor, and the elements that you are describing now of how God matters in such discussions also play out there. But I guess, generally speaking, people have the feeling, well, eventually this is the real difference, that people used to be enchanted, they're disenchanted now. And so that for me also helps, if we get that more straight, to see why it doesn't really make much sense to bring in the argument, well, people killed before and people killed today, and that's not really what it's about. So I'm gonna be a bit vague here, but I guess you know where I'm
Okay.
trying to get at. So go ahead.
Sure. Yeah.
Deconstruct the disenchantment narrative.
Yeah. So in the first chapter, it's a deep dive into Weber. And I'm trying to show that even Weber doesn't buy that version of disenchantment, right? I mean, for one thing, disenchantment is the usual English translation of Entzauberung, right? The demagicking or the unmagicking of Western society, of modernity. This is a term that Weber doesn't use until quite late in his career, and then just a few scattered references. It's not in the first edition of The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. It's only in the second edition in 1920, right before he died. We tend to think that this is a kind of well worked out, important concept for Weber, and it's really not. You go looking for it, and there's just a few scattered references to it. So I try to show in the first chapter that Weber himself has a few scattered references to the disenchantment of the modern world, but he also talks about the polytheism of the modern world. Basically, he thinks that all gods are inventions, and that once we get rid of the old gods, we create new gods, which for him were primarily the market and the state. And he's, again, much more pessimistic than Marx or Nietzsche, because he thinks that since there is no order to the universe and we're all just making it up, we create these complex systems that then kind of react back against us, and we're trapped in that way. And so I'm trying to argue that even Weber doesn't buy this idea of disenchantment, that we've become kind of rational and logical, but now we've just, the title I wanted for the book was Many Old Gods, because Weber has this quote, many old gods ascend from their graves and take the form of impersonal forces. And by this, he's thinking capitalism and the state and so on. For some reason, Oxford University Press did not like that title, and so they gave it a title that I suppose will come up in more search engines
I guess
or
so.
something. But anyway, but that's a quote from Weber. So I'm trying to show that even Weber didn't buy this argument. And then in the second chapter, I try to show that Taylor's use of it, Taylor doesn't really buy it ultimately either. He has all of this stuff about how, we can all agree that they used to, 500 years ago, people lived in an enchanted world and we don't anymore. Now we've become buffered cells instead of porous cells and all this kind of stuff. But then he's got all of this stuff about how, consumerism is almost a stronger form of magic than the Catholicism it replaced in Britain. Naturalism verges on religion. Rock concerts are putatively, all of these kind of hedge terms where it's almost there. And then finally on page 768 of The Secular Age, he says, people who adopt this immanent frame, they're really responding to transcendent reality, but misrecognizing it. And it's like, yeah, that's what you should have been saying all along, right? I mean, Taylor is a Catholic, right? And a believing, practicing Catholic. And so this is what he wants to say. And so then I go on in chapter 3 to talk about idolatry and the biblical concept, because that's really what Taylor needs, is a concept of idolatry. No, there really is a God out there, but we're responding and misrecognizing that God. And that, of course, includes all of us people that claim to believe in God, right? We're not immune from this. We all worship, and we all worship badly, is one of the things I kind of repeat in the book. But this idea that we're kind of living in some sober, de-magicked, rational age, I think is just, even Weber didn't think so.
No, and that's indeed the point where I wanted to get to, that we can't escape the gods. They will be there, and we will be worshipping in any case. And so then, a bit like you've been saying, and another fine quote from your book, if everybody worships, we might as well try to worship a true God instead of a false one, which brings us back to this idolatry and what is true and false. And we're going to go deeper into that one now. But just one thing I wanted to add on Taylor when I was reading in your book, because often when he talks about disenchantment, it's about the wood sprites and the spirits and the goblins and whatever, and the fairies that people believed in. And obviously we don't believe in that anymore. And I was thinking, even that one people still believe, but in different forms. And trying to think of a good example, I thought about serotonin and the idea that there's this molecule in your brain which makes you either happy or depressed. It's something from outside of yourself that is there in nature and somehow would influence you. Now, science is pretty clear on the matter. The whole serotonin idea was something that really helped sell antidepressants, but that doesn't really work. It doesn't really work like that in reality. And so for me, it's a good example of how mechanistic materialists also believe in fairies. They have this idea that there's some thing out there that influences the way they behave and the way they feel. But in reality, it's not really there. It's just an aspect of their worldview, and it's as magical, as you say, as it would have been if you did believe in fairies.
Yeah, interesting. I was doing a seminar on this book just a couple of days ago down at SMU in Texas. And one of the people pointed out that according to some polling, there are like more than 60% of Icelandic people, Icelanders, I guess you call them, believe in elves, or at least are open to the possibility of the existence of elves. I can't remember what the term in Icelandic is for these creatures, but the closest English equivalent would be elves. And there have been people that have gathered to block construction projects because they are, the place where elves live and so on. Another thing that I cite in the book is that according to polling, more people in the UK believe in ghosts than believe in God. Yeah, so even on
Yeah,
that level, even on the level of wood
yeah.
sprites, right?
Even those haven't gone yet.
It's still
Yeah,
right.
yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Okay, great. Let's go to perhaps some forms of idolatry, and we'll take a couple of those that you discussed. And I'd like to begin with one that you didn't make a whole chapter of. It's a bit on an aside, but I kind of liked it. It was about, I guess, in the chapter about Weber on bureaucratization of society, because he talks a lot about it. And then you mentioned this bureaucratization of your own institutions, of colleges and universities, which I know myself as well, of course. But it's not just for the university; it's all over the place, and it really made me think of David Graeber's Bullshit Jobs. That's one of my own interests outside of my theology and religious studies, and so it made me think of his bullshit job concept and the problem of being overwhelmed, all of us, by surveys, forms, and Excel files, and so on.
Oh, Lord, yeah.
And so maybe let's take that one. How do you see the concept of idolatry explaining how we got into this mess?
I mean, for you can hardly do better than Weber, right? If you live in this world where there is no kind of preset order, but you're all kind of making it up, then you create these structures that then have a tendency to kind of react back upon us and oppress us, right? Because things are unmanageable, and so we're subject to self-management in this kind of unmanageable way. My university was founded by a Catholic religious order who believed in God and Jesus and outreach to the poor and so on. And once the kind of central mission of the university fades, then you try to create a sense of mission by means of surveys, right? You can't impose any sort of mission on anybody else. And so what you try to do, we're endlessly going through these visioning exercises where we all get together and try to decide what we believe by, what the university's mission is by means of survey. And that then just becomes, in the face of kind of lack of belief in a real God, we just create these other kinds of structures which will give us a sense of structure and meaning even when there isn't any, right? We now have an award at my school called the Spirit of Assessment Award.
Excuse me?
And it's all about I have told people if I ever get the spirit of assessment, they should call an exorcist, right? But we go through these endless assessment exercises, which never result in anything useful.
What is the award for?
It's for being enthusiastic about these assessment exercises, which everybody hates. I mean, it's just because they're worthless. The head of the journalism school, Medill Journalism School at Northwestern University, just announced a few years ago that they're not doing them, and they're not going to be accredited anymore. And they can do that because they're one of the best journalism schools in the country. But other people don't have that luxury. But she basically said this is a colossal waste of time and money, and we're not doing this anymore. So if we have to lose accreditation, we don't care. And a little cheer went up from all sorts of other people.
Interesting type of revolution there. Now, in all of that, an idea that I found very interesting in your book is how, in a certain sense, dehumanizing becomes always a form of divinizing. In the sense that by stripping humanity from institutions, by acting as if they're not run by human people, but that they're run by something like neutrality or mere efficiency and rationality, universal concepts that we can all agree on. And there you have it, this idea of this universal, neutral, rational, not tainted by the human fall, you could almost say. I like that idea. By dehumanizing, you're divinizing. You're creating this idea that it's bigger than you. And you're wrong if you don't follow the procedures correctly, because the procedures cannot be anything but good because they're overarching. And if you think about it, that's exactly the same thing as the myth of no myth of secularism and science and so on. This idea that there's this rationality that transcends human rationality and we should conform to it. So I like it. Getting rid of the humanity is creating this divine. But it's all, the strange thing is, it's all done in terms of humanity. We're taking away God so that it, like the service, we're asking you what you want. But it's all done in the name of rationality and efficiency, which is not what I want.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Yeah, no, I think Weber is brilliant on that score.
Yeah. Just one thing, because we're talking about this divinizing of abstract concepts, and you could see those as idolatrous. You were creating this God, even if it's an institution, even if it's a concept. But there is a stark contrast, of course, with this kind of idolatry and a type of idolatry which is, let's say, divinizing a human being. The pharaoh in ancient Egypt, or today the amounts of people that the many amounts of people that follow Elon Musk rather religiously.
Taylor Swift,
to give just one example. So how do you relate those two? Because they seem to be very different types of idolatry, or do you think no? Ultimately, it's about the same thing.
The two being the kind of abstraction versus the
concrete human beings that are divinized and thus more blatantly idolatriized or idolized.
Idolized, right? Yeah. That's interesting. I don't know how to answer that question. I would have to do a lot more thinking about that. I always thought that I suggested in the introduction that celebrity would be another good subject for an examination by idolatry. But let me just attempt something. I'm not sure if this is right or not, but Taylor Swift is never just Taylor Swift, right? Taylor Swift is part of this huge money-making machine. And so it's never just about the idolization of one person. You know, Trump in some ways just is a stand-in for so many other things. I mean, populism has been defined as the kind of gathering of disparate grievances into an empty signifier. And so Trump is this kind of empty signifier, the idea that this, wealthy and completely unscrupulous New York real estate mogul is going to care about people living in trailers in Alabama, is just ridiculous. But he's this empty signifier onto which all sorts of grievances are cast. And so it's never really about the person themselves in some sense, at least in that case, right? It's about the ability to kind of marshal all of these other sorts of grievances or other kinds of forces and direct them in a certain way. Anyway, does that have any plausibility?
It certainly has a lot of plausibility. Also, because I wanted to go to consumerism, which you do have a whole chapter on, and analyze that one from the perspective of idolatry. And if you talk about Taylor Swift, it's not just about her; it's about the whole consumer system around it as well. So let's go there, and also let's go there partly because it's a good example of where I really get frustrated. It's so obvious how religious consumerism is And then still people seem to think that we're secular, and so obvious in the sense of, I mean, Jesus talked about the worship of the mammon. No, obviously he didn't really mean a god, which is a money god or something, and he simply meant running after richness and so on, which is exactly what we're doing. And then in the case of the US, you even have your equivalent of the golden calf in the Bible. There's this bull in Wall Street. So that one I never understood, how Americans, of which a whole bunch of them see themselves in an identity sense. They think of themselves as Christians, but also capitalists. And then you've got this image of capitalism, which is really the same thing as what is being described in your Bible, and people somehow don't seem to relate the two together or bring the two together. It's always baffled me. But so,
I use that image all the time, actually. When I give talks, I use that image all the time. Timothy Fitzgerald put that on the cover of his book, Discourses of Civilization and Barbarity. And it works brilliantly.
Yeah, absolutely. So go ahead. What do you think is the most important element to take out of everything that we have been discussing to analyze consumerism from the standpoint of idolatry?
Yeah, so I want to... I'm trying in that chapter not just to make this another screed or Jeremiad against, people have bad values and they're materialistic and they, want too much stuff. And, so I start out with Mary Douglas and Daniel Miller, and they talk about the way in which all people, and they're, anthropologists talking about, people in very poor societies without a lot of things, but we all kind of arrange material objects around us to tell certain stories about who we are and what we do. And there's something sacramental in that, and I want to recognize that. Mary Douglas, of course, was a Catholic, and this is very important for her. What I don't think they see is the difference between so-called primitive cultures and a kind of modern capitalist culture, both quantitatively and qualitatively, right? I mean, it's one thing to gather a few items around a hut, and it's another thing to have, one study says the average German owns 10,000 things, which is an extraordinary, just the explosion of things since the middle of the 19th century has just been impressive quantitatively. But qualitatively, also, what that kind of sympathetic take ignores is all of the people that suffer and the environmental destruction that goes behind that. And so Marx's concept of commodity fetishism, I think, is really useful. It's not just about, obsessing about things, but what's really crucial about it is this dual, he calls it the conversion of people into things and the conversion of things into people. And that's, I think, exactly what's going on, especially with online shopping, right? Is that all we see are things. We're just immersed in images of things, and you just click and they magically appear on your doorstep, just abracadabra, the next day. And you never have any contact with a human being or any even contact with an image of a human being. You have no idea where this stuff comes from. What kind of, rivers were polluted to make this stuff. There's rivers in Vietnam and China that have turned blue and black and red from, industrial dyes. Bangladesh, not Vietnam. You just don't see any of that. You don't see the people laboring in the Amazon warehouse and so on. And that's the crucial thing. So people talk about one of the problems, especially with the ecological crisis, is anthropocentrism, where humans have been put at the center. But I just don't think that's the case. I think things have been put at the center. And there's this whole way that we have of just erasing, of disappearing people in that process. And so that has a lot of parallels with what you find in the Bible, Psalm 115, Psalm 135, right? The people who make idols become as deaf and dumb and mute as their idols, right? And so there's this exchange where things become animated as gods and the humanity is drained out of people, and that's why I think that's the key element that I'm trying to bring out in this analysis of consumer culture.
Interestingly enough, the kind of jars with some things that you say that Saint Augustine has written and said about idolatry. I'm gonna read one of your quotes from the book again. For Augustine, idolatry, despite its outward appearance as dedication to something other than the self, is rooted in a kind of self-love, though one that paradoxically results in the dissolution of the self. Well, it's not really conflicting, but my question is a bit, because you're saying, well, it's not so much idolatry of the self. We're really starting to worshiping things and putting that first. And I'm still wondering,
right,
isn't underneath all forms of idolatry some form of idolatry of the self?
Yes, yeah, I think it is. I think it is, right? Because nobody worships a bottle of Snapple. Nobody worships the latest clothes that they get. And that's one, of course, and that's essential to the system, right? You can't actually fall in love with things in a permanent sort of way, or you wouldn't be urged to go on and buy the next thing, right? You have to be disillusioned with whatever the latest thing that you get. That new car smell dissipates, and you gotta move on to the next iPhone or whatever it might be. You can't be happy with what you've got. You've constantly got to be dissatisfied with what you've got. So it's not about kind of worshiping things. It's about constantly being caught in this feedback loop of trying to attain some level of satisfaction or happiness or self-worth or identity, whatever it might be, through the purchase of these things, which inevitably then fail to satisfy, right?
Which brings us back to the God-shaped hole in the heart of people, of course. They're trying to get to this heavenly bliss, let's say, and they're trying to fill it in with consuming instead of really going to the heavenly bliss that they probably are trying to get at, and that can only, for a theologian, of course, which I'm as well, it makes sense to see that heavenly bliss eventually can only be found in some divine ground of reality. But before that one might get us into how do we get out of this idolatrous state of mind in society, I'd like to ask you, how do you think about self-development then? Because in a sense that's the ultimate self-worshipping idolatry. There's a whole industry around self-development, but on the other hand, you cannot but say that God wants us to thrive. So if the love of God wants us as individuals to be all we can be, the way he created us, how do we square that with this self-development industry, which seems to have all this consumerist idolatry tendencies to itself? Where do you draw the line? Where is self-development divine in origin, and where does it become idolatrous?
The lines usually are not clear. And that's one of the things that I try to present in the book as well, is that it's usually not as blatant as somebody bowing down to a statue of Baal or something like that, right? And so it's often very hard to, how much money is too much money, right? All of these kinds of things are hard to discern, and they're on a continuum of more and less, so it's not a simple sort of thing. But the essential paradox is what Jesus says, those who would save their lives will lose it, and those who will lose their lives for my sake will save it. And so the way, paradoxically, that we build up a self in the good sense is precisely by giving it away, by becoming a gift to others and breaking down the boundaries between me and you or me and God, right? And so that's the kind of paradox that Jesus is trying to get at there. So that's the importance of the fifth chapter, well, both the fourth and the fifth chapters on Augustine and on Jean-Luc Marion, right? Marion has this analysis of the idol as a mirror, right? So it's essentially a kind of narcissism because you're looking for God, but then you find things that basically reflect your own desires back on yourself. And so you get caught in this feedback loop. And so it's not just that God is mad because God wants everybody to worship God and we're worshiping something else. The problem is it's not the true construction of a self because we just get caught in this feedback loop where our desires are just mirrored back to us, oftentimes for the profit of other people. And so the self-help industry is an industry that in which you're constantly sort of working on yourself, and you're caught in this feedback loop, but it's not just yourself because you're usually shelling out money to somebody else to pay for this. And so that's why eventually I think we need to get to Christ and the incarnation in the final chapter, where it's precisely this pouring out of God in the incarnation, that the kind of giving of the self away that gives us paradoxically a way to recover the true self and to get out of this kind of feedback loop.
I think you'll have to elaborate a bit more for most of the listeners. What exactly do you mean by the outpouring love of God and how it gets us out of the feedback loop? How do you see that happening?
The final chapter is on incarnation and sacrament. So if idolatry is making material things or the self into God, then I'm looking for a way of finding God in the material, which is not idolatrous, right? And so incarnation and sacrament are precisely this practice of finding God in the material, God in Jesus Christ, God in bread and wine, God in all these kind of tangible forms, and then kind of out into the world, finding God in the beauty of nature and so on, without divinizing things, as it were. So the incarnation is really important for that. But the incarnation is the kind of outpouring of God, the kenosis, right? The self-emptying of God, as Paul says in Philippians 2, in which it's not just the sort of dissolution of the self. We're not all just called to kind of dissolve into, this self-giving. But the whole point of the incarnation and the kenosis of Christ is to gather this community in which the boundaries between me and you and us and them are relativized and broken down, right? So when one rejoices, all rejoice together. And when one suffers, all suffer together, as Paul says in 1 Corinthians 12 about the body of Christ. And so it's this attempt to get beyond the me self and out into a kind of wider self that includes all of us and God in this kind of harmony where we share the same nervous system, and those who are weakest are treated with the greatest honor, and so on.
Yeah. I think we have to underline here a bit something which we have said here and there during our conversation, or we have referred to, and the fact that it's not because you're a believer that you're not idolatrous. Like you've said a couple of times, we all worship and we all worship badly. Because I think the explanation that you just gave might sound to some like, yeah, well, but that's not how I see people living their Christianity. And I guess that's the whole point, where all of us, whether Christian or Hindu, Muslim, or all of us are worshiping something, and we probably do it badly. So the Christians as well, it's the idea that we're trying to get at, but we're not necessarily there.
Oh Lord, yeah, right. I mean, yeah, Christians can be the worst idolaters, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you see it with the cult of Trump in amongst evangelicals in the U.S. Right now.
Yeah, a very
Yeah.
good example indeed. But so that being said, I am wondering, however, about, you've said it, you're speaking as a theologian, of course, and as a theologian, you bring in this normative argument. But is there an argument as well for the atheist? Is there an argument for the atheist? How does he get out of the feedback loop of, because as we've been explaining from the perspective that we've been talking about, every atheist is just as much a believer in God in some sense. So how can he worship the real God if in essence does not want to believe in a God?
Yeah, well, I mean, at some point, we just got to lay all our cards on the table. And I'm trying to do the best I can to kind of break down this dichotomy between believers and non-believers. That we all believe in something. So you tell me what you believe, I'll tell you what I believe, and then let's have a conversation, right? So I'm telling you what I believe, right? I believe that there is a God out there. And that Jesus Christ is or the revelation of this of the fullness of this God, which doesn't mean that I think everybody else is going to hell or all of that kind of thing. But that's what I believe. That's what it means to call myself a Christian. Is that I believe that God is real, and that Christ reveals something really important about God. And so I'm just going to put that out on the table, and then people can make of that what they will. I'm not going to write, but I can't write a book about idolatry for atheists, right? I mean, the concept of idolatry includes all of this kind of blurring of the lines, but it also includes the idea that there is a real God out there, right? And so the book begins with the quote from the novelist David Foster Wallace, who once said to the graduates of Kenyon College, look, there's no such thing as atheists in the actual trenches of everyday life. Everybody worships. The only choice we get is what to worship. And the reason that you might want to worship something like a god, Wallace says, is that everything else you worship will eat you alive. Right? Worship money and you'll never have enough. Worship your looks and you'll always feel ugly. Worship power and you'll always be scared, and so on. And that's the message of the book. So you might as well worship a real God rather than a false one.
When you bring this in, there was, for me, a sense, certainly when I was reading a chapter on Augustine, this the need for a thorough mystical conception of the divine, of God, in the sense that if we're talking about this type of God that goes beyond everything that might be idolatrous, it is a God that's beyond any type of image eventually. And it is the good itself. It's not because you think, or the truth itself, not in the sense of I happen to have the truth in my brain about what the real
Right.
God is, but he is truth. He is being, or like David Bentley Hart wrote about the experience of God, conscious being bliss, the Satchitananda in the Hindu terminology. And I constantly had this feeling that's also what St. Augustine seems to be trying to get at, that everything that you create will never be the good itself, the truth itself, being itself, blissfulness itself. And that's what you're trying to get at. But you always stop at what the truth and the good and the being has created. Things
Mm.
are, but they are within a deeper mystical ground of existence, which is God. And that's the fullness. And that's where you want to get at. Is that also an important concept for you personally? It's actually a pretty personal question. Where is when we're breaching the boundaries between the secular and the religious, for me, one of the most fun parts is that you can bring mysticism back into politics. And so you're a
Yeah.
political theologian, but how does your personal mysticism connect with your personal politics?
Yeah. Gosh. There's just a whole set of interesting things to delve into there. But yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, Augustine, of course, said, "Si comprendis, Deus non est," right? If you understand it, then it's not God, right? And that's something that I think is essential to Christian theology and every other kind of theology, right? A kind of apophatic moment where you say it's much easier to say what God is not than it is to say what God is. And every time you start talking about God, you're going to end up saying something false. Maimonides, I think, great medieval Jewish philosopher, I think was quite strong on this and kind of went so far as to indicate that anything you say about God is idolatry, and there's something that I think is true about that. So this whole exercise, in a lot of sense, can be understood as an attempt to kind of protocols for trying to avoid idolatry, but knowing that we're going to fall into it, and that's where the kind of sympathy, the kind of sympathetic moment comes in, that we all worship badly, and it's not because we're all bad people, but it's inevitable that our worship is going to fall short of what God actually is, and so a great deal of humility is necessary on this score. And I've often thought it would be an interesting exercise. You asked about politics. It would be an interesting exercise to understand what a politics of humility might look like. I don't think I'm humble enough to write that book. Who can write a book on humility, right? Now I'm going to explain to you what humility is all about. I mean, but a politics of humility, I think, would be really interesting, and it has a lot to do with violence, of course, too. Is that violence? The use of violence comes from the idea that we are good enough to use violence wisely and well. And that's almost never the case, right? That we are going to make history turn out right by using violence, and so nonviolence comes from, rather than this kind of sectarian exalted idea that we are the pure. It comes rather from, at least for a figure like Dorothy Day, I've written on this before, comes from this kind of deep sense of humility that we're just not good enough and we don't know enough to use violence well. So there's your next book,
Yeah,
Jonas. You have to write a book on politics and humility.
I guess I'll
And
leave that over to you, but it's indeed a brilliant point that you bring in there, because I think it really gets to the essence of, like you say in the book as well, the point of violence is not that you believe in God, but it's that you act as if you are God. If you place yourself in the place of God, that's when violence starts. And so, yes, I get your point about normativity, bringing in the normativity of God. But I guess for me, the biggest difference. Even when you're idolatrous, if you can do it in a humble way, that would be pretty fine to me. It's just that I believe that the real idea of God, the one that is always greater, like they say in Islam as well, Allahu Akbar, people tend to forget that the sentence really means God is greater. It's not just God is great, but God is greater. He's always bigger. So we need to be humble. And so it's the humbleness that whatever our type of worship is, that's the one that's going to make it non-violent, hopefully.
Yeah.
And I just think we have a better chance of being humble people if we mirror ourselves in the greatness of God and realize just how small we are in the face of all that divinity. That probably helps us to be a bit more humble.
Yeah, that's good. That's good.
Great. This was a lovely conversation. Thank you very much, Bill. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Jonas. This is a delight as always.